Well, right now I'd like to cover the issue of international comparisons of gun violence. And I think for this video I want to focus on just one comparison, and that's the comparison of the United States with the UK. In the past, when I've debated people about gun violence, they will basically say it's very clear that guns should be restricted, and the proof of this can be found in the fact that we have in the United States fairly easy access to guns, at least in most cases. And in the UK, they're very heavily restricted, not completely banned. It is legally permitted for people like the royal family and the prime minister. They do have actually fairly decent access to guns. And normal people in the UK have access to at least a few firearms, but they have many more restrictions, and they have a lower homicide rate, lower gun homicide rate, and this is supposedly excellent evidence. But to just compare one country to another country, there's no control variable there. There are, to my mind, several really obvious factors that make the comparison not a good one. The United States is a far larger nation with far more, more urban centers, also far more rural centers. Uh, and, the UK is an island. The UK is a fairly homogenous, this is becoming less so, but a fairly homogenous society. Uh, if you look at the United States, we have minority groups that are almost as populated as the entire UK. I think the population of the UK is something like 65 million. We have our two largest ethnic groups, blacks and Latinos, are both, in the neighborhood of 30 million apiece. And that doesn't count all the other ethnic groups, of which there's basically everyone that you can think of. And the thing is that it is true that the UK has a lower homicide rate than the United States. That's absolutely true. Certainly has a lower incidence of deaths by guns, although I don't know that their suicide rate is very much different from ours, but their suicide rate relative to guns is certainly less than ours. But the thing is 100 years ago, we could have had this same debate. We could have said, hey, the United States is a very violent society relative to the UK. The United States has a much higher homicide rate. If you look at like a city of New York and the city of London, New York has, I think, always had 4 or 5 times the homicide rate of London, as long as they've been keeping records, which in the case of New York has been at least 200 or 300 years. But the thing is we could have that discussion about how violent America was 100 years ago, but we couldn't possibly have attributed it to a difference in gun laws, because 100 years ago, the gun laws in the United States and the UK were essentially the same, in the sense that there were practically none. There were a few. It's my understanding that in the UK at that point, in the 1870s, they issued permits to carry a gun, but these permits were given to anybody who applied for them, and they just cost a paltry fee, that they didn't prevent people. And in both countries, there were basically no restrictions on type. Any gun that was manufactured was at least legally allowed to be for sale. Now, it doesn't mean that they all are marketed for public use, but most of them were. And I know people will likely say, well, 100 years ago, they would only be muzzle loaders, and that's not true. Machine guns have been around for more than 100 years, and they've been on the market for that period, and as have bolt-action rifles, even some early semi-automatic handguns, revolvers, certainly. Bolt-action rifles, today in the civilian environment can easily be called sniper rifles, and yet these would have been freely available. And so clearly, Even with the same gun control laws, the United States has had a much higher homicide rate than the UK. And if you look over the 20th century, starting basically after World War I, both countries have instituted more gun control laws. Now, the UK ultimately implemented far more and far more sweeping and comprehensive gun control than did the United States. But the thing is if gun control laws, reduce crime, then over the 20th century, as the United States and Great Britain passed gun control laws, they both should have seen a drop in crime. And quite frankly, that isn't the case in either. In the United States, violent crime saw a peak in the 20s and 30s, which, as far as I know, there's no question that had to do with prohibition. Prohibition created a lot of crime. There was no reduction of gun control after World War I, and then there was a crime spike. Booze were outlawed, and there was a rise in crime. And when Prohibition ended, there was a drop in crime. And then in the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s, there was a very large increase in the amount of violent crime in the United States. But at that same time, there were more and more gun laws. This is when concealed carry weapons were basically banned in almost every state. This is where registration in the states where it does exist, and to be sure, it does exist in many states to one degree or another. And the same is true of the UK. The UK has seen a rise in crime in the last 20 years. A lot of gun control gun proponents are quick to attribute this to their banning of guns. It's not clear that that's the cause. However, it is clear that when they have, they've instituted these restrictions, you don't see a drop in violent crime. The trends in crime seem to have basically very little to no relation to the institutions of new gun laws. And today, Britain has much worse crime than it did before. And the thing in the United States is after the mid-'80s, the United States has seen a drop in violent crime. A very, very continuous, not necessarily dramatic, but a very, slow but definite drop in violent crime. And the thing is gun ownership in the United States has increased. The number of guns in the United States has increased. And after the mid-'80s, there has been a very definite, especially at the state level, liberalization of gun laws. If strict gun control reduces crime, then the fact that we've seen a huge number of gun laws repealed in the United States, and again, especially at the state level, and the number of guns in private hands has increased. The number of people who own guns in private hands has increased, although it's difficult to say exactly by how much. If availability of guns is a cause of crime, then we should have seen a rise in violent crime. The United States has basically been seeing a decline in it. Now, it's not as low as it is in the UK, at least for some types of crime, at least for homicide. It is actually lower than the UK for things like muggings and certain other types of violent crime, not for homicide. That's definitely the case still. But the rate in the United Kingdom is basically going up or kind of staying the same, even as they've become more stringent. And so, aside from the fact that by saying, well, internationally there's proof here, when you only compare two countries, that's extremely weak. That's like not a big enough sample set to be making claims like that. And the other thing is when you look at the two countries, you don't see really any correlation that more gun laws, more restrictions have reduced crime. I mean, the correlation is actually a little bit negative in certain ways. It's usually very weak either way. I'm not one to say that you know allowing people to own guns is going to automatically end crime. There is a lot of evidence that it does have a pretty strong effect on certain types of crime, not necessarily homicide, but certainly hot break-ins. You know, here I don't know about in other places of the world, but in the United States, it's very common to see commercials for home security systems, where the family's sitting at home and then the window breaks and some robbers trying to get in, and of course in the commercials they activate their security system and the robbers run away. That's actually a very unusual scenario in the United States. People who break into homes in the United States are usually pretty careful to do it when there's nobody home. And the reason is pretty clear because the best estimates I've seen are that every other household in the United States has a gun in it, at least one. And there's no way to tell. Burglars have been killed in homes that were in cities that had handgun bans. I remember there was a case in Oak Park, Illinois, and also in Chicago before the gun ban was lifted, where home intruders died because they tried to rob a house that was occupied and they had a gun. And so they make a point to try and rob homes that are likely unoccupied, which is still a crime, but nobody's going to get hurt there. Now in the UK, it's my understanding that about half of all home break-ins occur when the residents are there, because there's very little chance that they would have an effective means to resist. And so I guess it's a little off topic, but the case that comparisons with other countries is somehow, especially with the UK, proves anything, it really doesn't. But I think I need to address all the other countries in the world, at least broadly, so that'll be in my next video.